Okay, we have some questions from Richard here. I was wondering if you might be able to tell me a bit about your own experience with your implants. Do you notice them on a daily basis, or have they become part of you? And how long have you had them? So those three questions kind of all wrapped into one. I've had this implant in my left hand since March 2005, so that's a little over 12 years, and it's been great. Like, I use it on a daily basis. It has become part of me, meaning it kind of conforms to one of our design tenets, which is it needs to be invisible, transparent, and frictionless or managementless. And so there's a fundamental difference and a psychological difference between picking up a tool like a smartphone or putting on a Fitbit or even wearing a ring that an implant has versus those things. So an implant is, I like to say, it's kind of like your kidneys or your heart. It's in there, it's doing its job. You don't really think about it, and that's exactly how an implant works. So these transponders just go in, you forget about them, but you use them on a daily basis, and they work really well. Um, what do you use them for? So mostly I use them for access control. Um, all of our X series transponders and devices are centered around RFID, which means identification, basically. And when you're talking about, products on a shelf, that's, counting inventory, checking something when it goes through a checkpoint. But in a human context, that usually means access. So every card in your wallet, every key on your keychain, they are identity tokens. They represent you to some system. And that's how these things work. They have an identity number, an ID or serial number, and you program various devices to do something with that number. So when you're talking about getting into a car, starting a motorcycle, getting into a fire safe, logging into a computer, you program those devices to honor the serial number. It adds the serial number to a list of authenticated serial numbers or authorized serial numbers, and you can get in. So in the case of like my motorcycle, I get on, I scan my tag, it powers up the bike, I can start it and go. It's a key, replacement, basically, one that I can never forget or lose. Logging into the computer, it's a password replacement. So it checks that serial number, checks it against a list of credentials, provides the credentials, logs me in, that kind of thing. With VivoKey, which is our kind of new product, it's still in the works. It's slated for launch as private beta in September. It is a fundamentally different type of implant. It still works contactlessly in much the same way as our NFC and RFID tags do, but it is a cryptographic processor, meaning rather than just a serial number or storing some static data, it can actually generate cryptography keys internally, and it can do cryptography internally. So the difference being, this static data that you have on a RFID or NFC card or implant, that's just static data. You can read it. Anybody can read it. You can set a password to protect it, but the password's also static. And overall, it represents what's called a symmetric system. So symmetric systems are, when you're a kid and you're like, hey, I'm going to send you a secret encoded message. Here's the key. Here's the password. You share that. It's symmetric. You both know the same password. But with the VivoKey, you can actually generate public key encryption key pairs. So PKI or public key encryption is really, really cool. It basically splits that thing up, that password up into a public and a private part. And so you have a public and a private key, I have a public and a private key. And what's interesting about it is it's a one-way encryption mechanism, meaning if I want to send you a message and ensure that only you can read it, I use your public key, and the public key is public. Anybody can see it. Anything that's encrypted with the public key, only the private key for that public key can decrypt it. Nobody can just take that same public key and decrypt the message. It has to be the private key that was paired with that during the creation of those keys. So that in that way, we can send each other secret messages using the public key, and we don't have to share a private key. We don't have to be symmetric. And so in that way, if I want to use VivoKey with a system, I don't have to send the key, the important part, out of the VivoKey. It can stay in the VivoKey. I can send the data that I want to encrypt or decrypt into the VivoKey. It can do the encryption, decryption there, and then kick out the data. So it's a way of protecting keys in a way that other implants just can't do. So it's really, really interesting and useful. Have you had any medical problems with them? Do you think their concerns about health impacts are justified? I've not had any medical issues. The billions of animals that have been implanted for decades have not had any medical issues. And I'm not sure what the concerns are that you're talking about. What concerns are you referencing? Because there are none as far as I know. There are people that speculate, sure. There's people that just kind of talk about, well, infection and all this, but the reality is the major medical risks are infection. That's it. Rejection, your body kicking out the tag, that is a function of infection. So when you look at it that way and say, okay, infection is the risk factor here, across the breadth of things that we do to our bodies as human beings, ear piercing is probably really, really, really common. And it's probably the most common body mod in the whole planet. And so if you think about what that is, you're taking an earlobe and you're pushing a needle through one part of it out through the other part and then leaving a piece of metal there. And that skin has to heal around that metal, and that takes days or weeks. And during that time, your risk of infection is high because you have an open wound. Um, an implant for one of these chips, it has a needle that goes under the skin, deposits the transponder, and then is removed. And then within a few hours, you have a scabbed over wound, and your risk of infection drops to next to nothing. So comparing those two things, ear piercing, which you can be done at a shopping mall by a teenager with a piercing gun, that is totally socially acceptable. That risk is totally acceptable enough that moms get their infants' ears pierced. We accept that, but somehow the idea that there's a higher risk factor for an implant is just false. It doesn't exist. So compare it to ear piercing, it's orders of magnitude less risky. The question becomes, why wouldn't you do this? Let's see here. What concerns about tracking and privacy? Those concerns are also unfounded. They're false. They're based on Hollywood movie concerns. There is no real tracking issue. Um, the reality is your telephone, your smartphone, your credit cards, anything you use on a daily basis to interact with the world digitally has way more tracking capability. And when I say tracking, I mean in the case of the smartphone where some nefarious app is using your GPS chip to actually track you in real time, your location, that does happen. Um, but more often people are talking about tracking in terms of like parcel tracking, like tracking a package. That's actually logging. It's not tracking. You just know somebody was here at this time and date, and or a package or an object or whatever. So in that case, anytime you use your tap and pay card or any digital payment method at all, there's a tracking that's happening. You're letting 3 or 4 companies in that payment chain know you were here on this date, you spent this much at this store, and we don't think twice about it. So the concerns about it are really unfounded. The reality is the chip itself is a consensual use device, just like your credit card. So you have to place it, within an inch of a reader to get a good read on it. It's just not going to be read without your consent out in the wild. It is technically possible to get maybe a few feet with a giant reader, but it's practically not viable. So it's not going to happen. Your phone, face tracking cameras, all that kind of stuff that's already deployed in the world is doing a way better job for way less cost, and we seem to be fine with it. So it's not really an issue. Are you concerned about some of the work that's been done recently on transmitting viruses or corrupting implants? Mark Gasson. Yeah, I know Dr. Mark Gasson. He's awesome. We talked a lot about it, and his project was a proof of concept. He actually had to purposely cripple or malform code to be able to make that work. The types of vulnerabilities that he displayed were in the readers and the backend systems, not in the implant itself. Had nothing to do with the implant. The purpose of the project was to bring to light security issues around implantable devices, particularly medical devices. So at the time, remember, like pacemakers were just now starting to get radio capability to be able to talk to doctors wirelessly, but there were no security measures. Somebody could walk up, literally change the settings on your pacemaker. Like it was really serious business, and people have died from that. Like, I think there was a case of an insulin pump being hacked through a hospital's network and killing the patient. And it took them 2.5, 3 years to figure it out that it was actual murder and not just a malfunction of the hardware. So this is a serious issue. But in the case of what Dr. Gasson put together, it was just to kind of shed light on it. It wasn't a serious concern about implants of this nature being compromisable. Level-headed views of peace. Yeah, okay. So that is it. I hope that was helpful for you. And let me know if you have any other questions.